The hammerhead's mouth was jagged as a knife wound. The ghostly form of the shark pressed itself against the wall of the glass tank, oblivious to the thrum of the generators and the pellucid light that dappled its pale flesh. Shadows moved like living things, leaping and sloping over the oppressively low ceiling and concrete walls of the aquarium. Lucifer Box was dead tired. He thrust 2 more benzodrine tablets into his mouth, stepped closer to the creature's enclosure, and watched his reflection balloon as though glimpsed in a fairground mirror. A step back, and the reality snapped into focus. A tall, slim, saturnine figure in the clinging form of the zebra Gorman wetsuit. The damp black hair scraped off the forehead, the cruel blue eyes dilated by the queasy gloom. Stealthy as a cat, Box moved on, leaving wet footprints on the concrete. Damn her! Damn the blasted girl! If it hadn't been for Stiletto, he'd be out of Hong Kong now, settling down on the Cathay Pacific out of Kai Tak, downing his 3rd single malt, looking forward to dear old rain-swept England and getting away, far away, from the sweaty horror that had been the search for Gottfried Clawhammer. As for Stiletto, Clawhammer's mistress, Box recalled the moment he'd first seen her, blindingly beautiful, clad only in an ivory-coloured bathing costume, lying prone on the deck of the Beguine. As the yacht bobbed at anchor, his eyes had devoured her. The long, lissom legs, the proud mound of the bikini, the perfect breasts in their pearly cups. Shaking his head, he tried to clear the image of Stiletto from his mind. Damn the silly bitch! She'd get such a spanking when all this was over. But first they had to get out of there alive. And his plan? There was none. Box turned a corner, and what he saw made his flesh crawl. Yet another huge glass tank stood before him. Within, submerged and bound hand and foot, stood Stiletto. Big lead weights were roped about her waist, her feet firmly anchored to the white sand that lined the bottom of the tank. The girl's turquoise eyes bulged with fright behind a diving mask, the ugly rubber mouthpiece of an aqualung clamped between the perfect O of her lips. She saw Box and tried to move, sending a stream of air bubbles rocketing to the surface. Then there was the sound of a distant lever being pulled. Something whooshed down a concealed chute, hitting the water like a bullet, and there was a sudden flurry of movement in the tank. A flash in the water, bright as silver, then a wall of glittering shapes soon resolved into the ugly gunmetal grey of a shoal of fish. Piranha! With a throb of nausea, Box saw the first of the deadly creatures taking an exploratory nibble of the girl's exposed white wrist. In one smooth movement, he unholstered his Beretta, took aim, and fired. The plate glass shattered with a massive percussion. Gallons of water vomited through the gaping hole, sending the piranha flapping and gasping into the fetid air. Stiletto collapsed at once, and Box rocketed forward, using the gun to smash at the remaining glass and allowing him to climb into the tank. He held onto her tightly and ripped the rubber mask from her deathly pale face. For a moment, she looked unseeingly at him. Then she smiled. "Oh, Lucifer, I knew you would come. I knew you would save me. For now there is only us. I want you to love me, Lucifer Box. I want you to spank me. Love me and spank me. To love me as if I was a beast. The lowest beast in—" "Box! Box, old man, shake a leg." I opened my eyes wide and blinked once, twice. Bewildered, I glanced about. Olive-green walls, a hissing gas fire, a cabbagey smell like a school dormitory. There was a loud creak as I straightened in the chair, though whether it was the cracked lever or my hips, I'm not sure. I scowled at the portrait of the new queen gazing down from the wall, as though blaming her for puncturing my dreaming, my lurid dreaming, I have to say. There's no other word for it. "You shouldn't have let me drop off like that," I said. "Damned embarrassing, snoozing in someone else's office." "Seemed ashamed to wake you," grinned Alan Playfair. "You looked so peaceful. And who wouldn't get a little drowsy after a slap-up nosh like that?" I recalled with a shudder the wet lettuce and scalpel-thin ham that had passed for lunch. "Besides," Playfair went on, lighting his pipe and extinguishing the match in a couple of swift swoops, "well, you've earned a rest." "Oh, don't say that, for God's sake. Makes me sound venerable." Playfair laughed explosively, his pipe jutting upwards so that the bowl almost touched his nose. "That," he coughed, "you will never be. Monks are venerable, old love. Oxbridge dons, too, but a scoundrel like you, I think not." Alan Playfair was about 45, with a utilitarian face and a suit as badly cut as his salt and pepper hair. A dependable chap, solid, respectable, and about to replace me. Me. Lucifer Box. The man who'd prevented the revivified zombie of Captain Scott destroying New Zealand with his steam dreadnought, the Terra Nova. The man who'd pursued and destroyed Dr. Cassavalonis Fetch and Acronym, the anarcho-criminal retinue of nihilists, incendiarists and murderers. The man who'd come out of the Second World War covered in glory, and certain unmentionables, after preventing the Nazis from exploding a miniature purgative inside the Prime Minister's guts. I had risen to the top of my curious profession, and was now officially Joshua Reynolds, President of the Royal Academy. Not the oh-so-respectable bastion of fine art you might be imagining, of course, but the front for Her Britannic Majesty's really, really Secret Service. My scandalous career had been quite a ride, but, like all good things, it had to come to an end. The Royal Academy was finally to be absorbed by the traditional MI6 mob, the Service, with their checkpoints and their microfilmed sex acts and their shabby little assassinations in rainy Czech alleyways. Playfair held up a hand. "Anyway, I'm in no rush, old love. You remember that. You have all the time in the world. What have you got on, anyway?" he asked. "I'm winding down gently." I shrugged. "Something down in Cape Town. A body. An old friend of mine, in point of fact. Looks like suicide. He drove his car into the bay." Playfair shook his head. "Oh, I am sorry." He got to his feet and buttoned his jacket. "Well, if you'll excuse me now, pleasure, as always, and I'm sure I'll see you again before you leave." "If you like." "Cheerio, old love." He took my hand and then glanced down at the desk, his attention already elsewhere. For all his bonhomie, I had been effectively dismissed. I went through into the outer office, a smaller, darker, cooler version of Playfair's. Miss Beverage looked up from her desk and smiled. Ah, Miss Beverage. Charming girl, carrying out her Sherpa-like duties for the service without a word of complaint. I'd always noticed her long, lovely neck, startlingly brown against the crisp white of her lace collar, the way her eyes disappeared into crinkled half-moons when she smiled, her infectious and frankly dirty Lancastrian chuckle. In addition, having studied dusty files of my adventures in her youth, she was a dedicated fan. Perhaps, over a Madeira or four, I could immerse myself in a very different Beverage report. The young lad's here, sir," she said brightly. "Oh, is he? Right. Thank you, Beverage." As I moved to the door, she looked up again. "Sir, I just wanted to say, good luck, sir, and, well, it won't be the same without you." "Thanks." I felt suddenly emboldened. I was wondering, I have an appointment tomorrow, rather a depressing matter, I'm afraid. Funeral, old friend." "Oh, I'm sorry to hear that, sir." "Well, I was wondering whether you'd be available to accompany me. I hate to go to these things alone. Then perhaps a spot of lunch, and I can regale you with tales of some of my more sensational past glories." To my delight, the girl's face lit up. "Oh, that'll be grand, Mr. Box. I can drive us there if you like." "Splendid." And, with as much insouciance as I could muster, I left the office and made my way down the peeling stairwell, grinning like a youngster and positively dancing on air. Awaiting me at the entrance was a little boy. He was sitting on a bench, legs sticking out before him like two white poles in neat grey socks. He looked up as I approached, but didn't smile. "Good afternoon, Christmas," I sighed.
"Hello, Daddy."
The Scouting Association has never held much appeal for me. I've no truck with paramilitary organisations. However, my son Christmas had taken to scouting with almost indecent fervour, and was forever knotting sheepshanks, sparking up campfires, and shinning up those ropes with waxy ends you find dangling in chilly school gymnasia. He'd done so well, indeed, that he was to participate in some sort of international camp, and it was my duty on that sultry afternoon to set him on his way. Christmas Box. You didn't see that one coming, did you? The product of too much Montrachet and a broken axle on the road to Zagreb, he was an indiscretion that didn't even have the excuse of being youthful. I'd done the decent thing for once in my life and given the brat my name, plus another in honour of the season. The Zagrebian temptress, you see, had deposited him on my doorstep one Yuletide Eve. Then I'd packed him off to some ancient boarding school for his betterment. On high days and holidays, I was obliged to take him out for an airing. Like his mother, the little squib had an unhealthy interest in outdoor pursuits, and so, somewhat reluctantly, I had enrolled the lad in the Scouts. Well, that's not strictly accurate, for with national service winding down and teddy boys slashing up the upholstery in crumbling picture houses, the Dib-Dib-Dibbers had been reborn as the grandly titled New Scout Movement. Its honorary chairman was the much-loved Lord Battenberg, and it was a real force for good, according to the Daily Mail, which is rarely a happy sign. For some unfathomable reason, the whole summer knees-up was set to kick off on one of those queer little islands that squat in the outer reaches of the Thames. Christmas and I motored through town, and then headed south through Richmond until we came to a crumbling wooden footbridge that connected the mainland to the island. Beyond lay a broad meadow, dotted with pyramid-shaped tents and small wooden houses, jetties leading from each to the river. The pathway was overhung by weeping willows. From beneath one of them, a woman in a well-cut skirt and jacket suddenly appeared. I took in her steel spectacles and a heart-shaped face of alabaster loveliness. Lustrous burnt sienna curls hung to her shoulders. Only a tiny scar just above the mouth marred the perfection. The newcomer extended a slim white hand. "Melissa Forethought," purred the stunner. "You must be Mr. Box, and here's my little Christmas." She planted a hand on top of the boy's beret, and he beamed up at her. "We're all thrilled and honoured to have such a clever young man as part of our team." Her green eyes widened. "You must be very proud." "Oh, bursting with it," I lied. "Positively bursting." Miss Forethought pushed an errant curl from her face. I couldn't keep my eyes off the tiny pulse beating in her pale throat. She had the look of a girl I'd fox-trotted across the floor at Maxime's on Armistice Day 1918. What a night! The Germans hadn't been the only ones to surrender. We moved on down the path. All around the meadow, bell-shaped tents had been erected, and there was that pervasive grassy smell one associates with village fetes and flower shows. Each tent swarmed with athletic-looking youngsters in khaki shorts and absurd sombrero-like hats. I was suddenly rather uncomfortably reminded of another youth group which had gained some little popularity in 30s Nuremberg. "You must forgive my ignorance," I said, stepping carefully over a guy rope, "but this camp of yours, what exactly goes on?" "You were never a scout, Mr. Box?" inquired Miss Forethought. I chuckled. "No, after your time, of course," she cut in. "What a shame." Tilting her head, she appraised me with a sort of pitying look that is the special preserve of youth. "You have funny names, don't you?" I said cheerily, for the wallers in charge of it all. "Something from Kipling, isn't it? The Mowgli, the Baloo." "Arkela." "That's the chap." I looked around. "Is he about?" Miss Forethought shook her head. "Not at present. We're very busy, as you can imagine." "Oh, quite," I said, "all that pop to uncork. So when does everyone arrive with the knees up?" Miss Forethought crossed her hands in front of her. "The jamboree begins next week. In Kingston." "Super," I said distractedly, imagining how disappointed all those foreign scouts would be with suburban little Kingston upon Thames. But no doubt gallons of ginger beer and pickled eggs would put them right. We were approaching a large dark hut, constructed from logs in that quaint fashion one associates with spa towns and skiing resorts. Inside, the place stank of damp. A long corridor stretched off immediately in front of us, the inset windows looking into cheaply panelled rooms. From the blur of white vests and navy blue pants within, it seemed the scouts were engaged in vigorous exercise. I was about to look away when I became aware that someone was watching us through one of the interior windows. It was a strange and sickly boy, hollow-eyed and jaundiced-looking, like the ghost of a Victorian child drowned in a weir. Limp yellow hair slimed its way across the pale forehead, and his arms and legs were pathetically shriveled in indigo pants and a startlingly white vest. He stared at me, unblinkingly, and I had the oddest feeling I'd seen him somewhere before. Then he was gone, swallowed up in the mass of vested youth tearing excitedly round the room.
Can I go now?
Piped up Christmas. I glanced down and his face was shining with excitement. Well, if the little scrap wanted to volunteer for all this leaping about and frog spawn collecting, who was I to gainsay him? So I left the lad in the capable hands of Melissa Forethought and bade farewell to them both. By the time I'd reached the footbridge again, my mind was already focusing with delicious anticipation on my appointment next day with Miss Beverage. Then, with a jolt, I reminded myself of the reason for our meeting. The internment of Christopher Miracle. The next morning at 11 o'clock precisely, the marvellous Miss B pulled up outside number 9 Downing Street in a black Triumph Mayflower that neatly complemented her jacket, skirt and nylons. Sporting a sombre Homburg on my snow-white locks, I clambered into the back of the car and we sped off through the suitably funereal rain. The journey took us about half an hour, most of it filled with Miss Beverage's earthy laughter, as I delighted her with tales of some of my juicier exploits. What a find that girl was. We arrived at the cemetery and got out of the car. As I straightened the Windsor knot on my tie, the girl opened a large umbrella and, thrillingly, hooked her arm through mine. Then, together, we set off through the rain-sodden graveyard. There were only a handful of brolly-bearing mourners grouped round the churned-up red earth, their wizened faces rendered blank and emotionless by the surfeit of burying that comes with old age. I nodded to acquaintances, fellow survivors of a shattered generation. Unbidden, images flickered through my mind. That first meeting with Miracle at one of Maudie Risborough's Chelsea crushes back in the naughty 90s. I was the ingenue dauber, pale, skinny, almost innocent. Miracle was the lionized portraitist, glowing, strapping, beautiful. He could have demolished me and my fragile reputation with a single gesture or a well-placed bon mot. But he'd shown me such kindness that dizzying afternoon that we'd soon become firm friends. Then had come the Great War, the Franco-Swiss mission to l'Île du Diable, and the injuries from which that wonderful blonde boy had never wholly recovered. Miracle had drifted through his money and the years, not quite committing to anything. When last I'd seen him, he'd just taken over, in a desultory fashion, a business that manufactured fruit cordial. Then it had all come to an abrupt end, with Miracle's Jaguar XK120 tearing wildly through the streets of Cape Town before plunging into the Atlantic. Whatever could have made him do it? An unnecessarily ginger vicar droned through the usual eulogies and then clapped shut the soggy pages of his Bible. I tossed a posy of flowers into the grave, crimson roses for mourning, violets for modesty, sunflowers for loyalty, and baby's breath for love everlasting. Propped up against a nearby headstone was a rather ugly arrangement of blooms done up into the shape of a bottle of squash. The M for miracle trademark had been picked out in poppies. I noticed my gloves were smeared with wet mud, but Miss Beverage was there in an instant, proffering a clean handkerchief. As I rubbed at the red stain, my gaze met that of a very fat man. He was perhaps 70 years, plum-purple, chewing rather noisily on something or other, and regarding his fellow mourners with what I can only describe as a sort of amused contempt. The features were somehow familiar, and I realized as Miss Beverage and I left the graveside that this must be Miracle's brother, Quintin. Although we had only met once or twice, I felt compelled to offer the usual sentiments. The girl and I fell into step with him as he ambled towards the gated exit. "Mr. Miracle?" He turned a smiling moon face towards me.
I am he.
"I don't know if you remember me," I said. "My name's Lucifer Box." Liquid mud squelched onto my black shoes. "I was a friend of Christopher's."
I'm afraid I must get on.
"I wonder if I could speak to you," I said quickly. In private?" He looked about as though hoping for a better offer, then shrugged.
Very well. It's slackening off, he noted, holding out a gloved hand and peering at the heavens. Shall we sit?
Quintin Miracle eased himself onto a bench and stared happily into space, chewing like a cow with its cud. His piggy eyes twinkled mischievously, and his hand darted into his trousers.
Can I tempt you with an all-sort?
Thank you, no, I said. He made a happy little noise.
You're lost, chum. Though, entre nous, I'm not so keen on the coconut ones. If I had my way, they'd do away with them and just have more licorice. Lovely black licorice, shiny as a beetle's back. The world could stand more licorice, don't you think, Mr.
Box?
Box, yes, I remember you now.
I'd like to speak to you about your brother, I said. Can you think of any reason why he would have wanted to take his own life?
The business with the motor car, you mean? None at all.
He smiled, and his teeth were streaked yellow-black.
Though he was never the same after the Somme, you know.
I looked down sadly. Yes, I do know.
Poor old Chris. Always had the looks, of course. Mamma's golden boy.
Was there a trace of bitterness in the younger Miracle's tone?
Suppose she just couldn't face it.
Face what?
Getting decrepit and ugly. But what's the alternative, eh? That's what I always say. Funny thing is, he continued, he'd seemed so much more full of life lately. Got quite interested in his business. Mind you, that hadn't been going so well of late, the orange squash lark.
No?
No, some sort of boardroom battle, a takeover bid.
Really? I asked, intrigued. By whom?
Search me,
said Quintin, winding a licorice bootlace round his fat finger and nibbling on the end.
Last letter I got from Chris mentioned it. He sounded a bit down in the dumps. They were offering more and more loot, but he didn't want to sell. Shareholders thought differently. Perhaps that explains why he did what he did.
Perhaps, though he never seemed the type.
Type?
To take his own life. Miracle's brother grunted.
Well, Mr. Box, I suppose they never do.
I rose and smoothed down my trousers. Thanks very much for your time, and again, my condolences. Miss Beverage was standing a little way off. I joined her, and we walked towards the car.
Find out what you wanted, sir?
She asked. Not really, I shrugged. Perhaps I'm reading too much into my friend's death. This was very kind of you, by the way, bringing me here.
Not at all, Mr. Box.
Please, I said, call me Lucifer. Miss Beverage flushed slightly.
Oh, no, sir, I couldn't possibly do that.
Why never not?
Oh, wouldn't be right, sir. I mean, you being who you are and all.
I laughed and adjusted my damp hat. That tingling anticipation was rising within me again. I was recently complaining to Mr. Playfair that I have no wish to become venerable. What's your name? Christian name, I mean.
Coral.
I stopped and held out my hand. "Hello, Coral." She gave a nervous laugh and shook it.
"Hello, Lucifer."
"See?" I said, walking on. "That wasn't so hard, was it? Now then, my glittering career. Where had we got to?" Coral Beverage's face became suddenly animated, like a child asking for her favourite bedtime story.
"Dr. Fetch! Dr. Fetch!" she said excitedly.
"Ah, now you're talking. Dr. Casavalornis Fetch, the man with the celluloid hand. He formed acronym around the turn of the century when I was in my full vigour, and you, my dear Coral, were no more than the first gleam of a twinkle. Fetch and I crossed swords many a time, back in the good old days."
How did he lose the hand?" she asked wonderingly.
I chuckled. Well, I could laugh about it now, although it was rather serious at the time. Fetch dressed himself up as a woman and infiltrated the suffragist movement. His intention was to go one better than Mrs. Pankhurst and throw a horse under the king.
"Flippin' heck."
Audacious scheme, would have worked,
But for you, sir."
I smiled. My God, I haven't thought about Fetch in years.
"You almost sound as if you miss him,"
she noted. Perhaps I do. Those were glorious days. Best of my life, really. I shivered, though not through cold, feeling glad to put the cemetery behind me. We had reached the car, and Miss Beverage held the door open for me. "Now then," I murmured, placing a gloved hand over hers, "how about that lunch?" She looked at my hand on hers and said, "Oh." Then she glanced down quickly at her shoes. No, thank you, sir. I think I'd better be getting home." I withdrew my hand as though scorched. "Coral, I'm so sorry. I thought perhaps you and I—" And now she looked me full in the face and laughed. The delicious tingle of anticipation began to disperse. My face fell. "I thought you might be keen to, you seemed as if you might want to."
"Oh, I'm right keen on that," she blurted out. "But you're too old for me, sir. Oh, don't bear thinking about."